All right, so in this module, we're going to be talking about Greece, mostly archaic Greece, which is early time period in Greece, and we're also going to talk about some Greek philosophy. But before that, we do that, we're going to talk about the Greek precursors, all right? And that's really two main groups, and that is the Minoans and the Mycenaeans. These two groups are Greek in terms of their ethnicity and language and things like that, and they're related to the Greeks, but they're not the same as, say, the classical era Greeks, who are obviously more famous. And that's people like Aristotle, Plato, Leonidas, the Spartans, all of this. And so before we get into them, we want to introduce these first civilizations in and around Crete. And that's where the Minoans and the Mycenaeans are at. So, again, we need to do a brief kind of word on geography. One thing I want you to take from this is that this is a completely new region than what we've been talking about. It is completely new to kind of beyond what we've talked about. We've talked about up here in Asia a little bit, but really this group is completely different than the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians for most extent. But they are inextricably linked in history and in geography. And we never really kind of understand that a lot of times, how integral the Greeks were. And so from a geography standpoint, they're kind of separated off, but they're also very much a part of getting information from Mesopotamia and then spreading that information all over the world. Okay, and so as history, the land still informs much of what these people do. Egypt, you have the Nile, and I think it's very clear that, like, say here in Louisiana, right? Like, we live in Louisiana, and other people from other parts of the country, what do they immediately think of? Swamps, right? So the geography of your land does inform what people think about your culture to some extent, and it's a little bit intuitive when you look at, like, hey, you look at the Greeks here. Here's Greece and Ionia. What's going to be really the number one thing that they kind of focus their culture around? And it's clear. It's here, the Aegean Sea. So many islands, right? And Greek culture really does get focused on this idea of island culture. Okay, Louisiana, we have the swamps, swamp culture. Egyptians, they have the Nile culture. The Greeks have the Aegean Sea. And for this lecture, we're really going to focus down here in Crete, because that's where the Minoans kind of get their start. But Greece is very unique among the cultures we've covered this so far in class. And it's important for quiz purposes to kind of remember that there is no major river in Greece that they can use for irrigation. They have smaller rivers, as you can kind of see to the bottom of down here in the right. You see some rivers here, but they don't have a Nile or a Euphrates or anything like that they can do major irrigation projects. So they lack that very rich alluvial soil that comes from flooding rivers, by and large, because the geography of Greece is different. The culture is going to develop and be very different as well. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. But right now, note that limestone mountains kind of divide Greece into chunks of these fertile plains. So you have these limestone mountains, and you have these fertile plains that are kind of in between them. You can kind of see here and here, and then these plains in between them. And that's basically the way Greece is geographically separated out. The Andes Mountains provide a barrier for communication. It means that the Greeks end up developing very distinct city-states as time moves forward. There's no getting around that simple fact. Mountainous region has made a huge impact on how the Greek society developed. About 80% of the country is mountainous. Only about 20% is suitable for agriculture. Most of it pretty poor quality with a couple exceptions. So when we compare that to, say, Egypt, they just can't do that large-scale agrarian cereal agriculture. They can't do large-scale barley and wheat, and they're by no means a breadbasket. Also, the climate is mostly dry and hot. And so this kind of all informs us quite a bit on what Greece ends up becoming. Now they are still an agricultural economy. They do have, some advantages. Olives, grapes, those grow really, really well here. And of course, you saw in the early slides there, Greece is surrounded by the sea, so obviously they're very, very adept sailors and seafaring, and they take olives and grapes, all over the place. And they're really hot commodities even today, olive oil and wine. So they make big business out of trading those commodities, and they use that to kind of recover from their short of how much they can make cereal grains. So it's a pretty easy economic thing to understand, but this is what it makes Greek really tick, is these two products in terms of their global trade with the rest of the trade network that we had kind of talked about, olives and grapes. And you can kind of see here, again, olive trees. You can see that they're farming grapes and olives and trading those. So now let's talk about the first precursor civilization known as the Minoans. And the Minoans live on the island of Crete. After the Minoans were the Mycenaeans. They're on the Greece mainland themselves, which would be right over here. Minoans here, Mycenaeans over here. And over here is Turkey, and we'll talk about the Greeks that live over there too, because really what Greece is, as much as anything, as it just surrounds the Aegean Sea here. And the mainland Greece is here, and the islands down here, and then all the way even to Cyprus. And all of this becomes part of the late Bronze Age trade network that we talked about in the previous module, right, that ends up collapsing. And so, but we're rewinding a little bit to kind of go back and talk about these precursor civilizations. So I don't want you to throw you off. These are not taking place in the Iron Age, right? This is all part of the late Bronze Age, early Bronze Age kind of time frame that we're going to be covering here. The Minoans lived on the island of Crete, as I mentioned. They have a major naval commercial center for about 500 years. You don't need to know the exact dates on that or anything, but you do need to know that they are on the island of Crete, and that this kind of syncs up with the timeline in Egypt, basically before the New Kingdom. And they're part of that trade network that really grows and then collapses around 1500 BC. They seem to disappear, and they're probably, assimilated by the Mycenaeans, but the Minoans really had an interesting culture. They export a lot of trade goods to the Mediterranean cultures around them, to the Near Eastern cultures that we've already talked about. This painting here on the right, these are Minoan vessels. And look at this piece of glass here. It's actually clear glass. You don't get to see that often. You have some clear glass in here. And then you also have... clear glass would have been extremely valuable, by the way. This is a place that has traded with other groups, even though it's not a powerful military empire or anything like that. It's just a civilization on an island that makes really good use of trade. And down here you have a pot. It's really exquisite, that an artist, formed in the era of around 2000 to 1500, right in the basically in the middle of that timeline. And look how beautiful it is. It's really incredibly well preserved. Great work, and it makes sense for kind of seafaring people to decorate pots with, like say an octopus, which is really kind of cool. Now, since they have very little farmland, being there on the island of Crete, fishing is really their livelihood. And that's really another kind of obvious thing about Greece and any seafaring civilization. They're not just for trade, but also... because you're a seafaring people, piracy is a good thing, and right, not like pirates from the Caribbean, right? Sorry, Jack Sparrow and the Caribbean pirates were not the first pirates, right? But piracy is kind of part and parcel of the ancient world. Even Rome deals with pirates, and they're a lot more famous for their interactions there. But the Minoans are going to capitalize on trade by stealing things too. It doesn't take a genius to figure out this is an island that's less wealthy in a lot of ways and has than some of these bigger empires. If they happen to catch one of those ships and they can get away with it, of course they're going to take that stuff. They're also the first civilization in this part of the world that haven't given us evidence of sewers, and I think that's pretty fascinating. Or that does give us evidence of sewers. Here you have basically a toilet, And it's, it does show it to be somewhat sophistication in the way they organize things, even though they're very small players. Definitely mice in the mice and cat and mice analogy, but they do some pretty interesting things. The Minoans build a capital at a city called Gnosis, and it becomes a center of trade for wine, olive oil, and wool. And we have some writing. We haven't been able to decipher that, but hey, if you want to be a historian, go get your PhD and figure out how to decipher this language, because there's a lot of stuff that we could really learn. Go figure that out, right? But around 1500 BC, they start to yield to the Mycenaeans. And like I said, from about 2000 to 1500 BC is kind of the crest of their civilization. And then they don't just, or they just all of a sudden fall apart and disappear forever. They seem, like I said, to be assimilated into the Mycenaeans, who are far more warlike, and they conquer them and intermarry them and so on. So that happens from about 1500 to 1100. And so it's a long process, and we don't really see any distinct Minoan culture from about 1500 on. And it seems that, again, they had merged with the Mycenaeans. But remember that Crete and Cyprus are all part of this late Bronze Age system of trade, right? We have some of their goods, like Mycenaean goods, on the Kos shipwreck. And so just to kind of review that point that we've made, and not to belabor it or anything, but they're going all over the place. Their stuff is showing up all over the ancient world, from Minoans and the Mycenaeans. Those copper ingots, where are we at? No, where are we at? The copper ingots from the Kos shipwreck likely came from the Mycenaeans. Big hunks of metal, and so they were really, really important in trade. So that copper ingot that we saw on the Kos shipwreck, look, this basically looks exactly like it up here. And this dude's got to be strong, because that's heavy. Now this is the gold mask of Agamemnon. It's a very fascinating object to scholars, because if it is actually Agamemnon from the Homer story, well, then you've got an interesting piece of evidence of the Homer story. But there's not a whole lot of scholars that actually think that this is Agamemnon. It's just kind of what has come to be called, but we really don't know. The Mycenaeans developed civilization after the Minoans have already increased their profits and stuff, and the Mycenaeans are on a Greek mainland with smaller islands throughout the Aegean, but like the Minoans, they're primarily merchants and traders or pirates. But they do have more emphasis on war than the Minoans, and they fight each other all the time. They, ransack and loot their neighbors when they can't trade. They're definitely the protagonists if you've read any of Homer's works. The Greek poet, the Iliad and the Odyssey. The Mycenaeans are the protagonists of those poems, so they're very, very famous for that amongst classicists. Their civilizations were fortified. They tended to be built up on elevations, on hilltops, which are great for defensive purposes. They show quite a bit of wealth and a lot of gold. And again, it's not a major united empire, but a series of city-states, which kind of becomes a pattern for Greece. Like, that's just what the Greeks do, just kind of like the Sumerians did. And in some senses, we're kind of backtracking with this era or idea of city-states and not unified empires. But we had this ebb and flow of empires and then city-states, and making, but empires really make stability and trade happen more. But when they collapse, we go back into this regional, city-state aspect, and then the empires come back, right? And we kind of follow this ebb and flow. And then it's pretty normal when Rome, who's sort of the empire to end all empires, when they fall, you go back to these small regional city-states. And really, they're kind of individual kingdoms, but it tends to be this roller coaster that humans are on. So the Mycenaeans were like the Minoans, very much mice in terms of the mice or cats of history. They do have writing as well, and in this case, the writing has been translated. We actually know that their script says that what their script says, because it was adopted later by the Greeks, and then the Greeks kind of used this hybrid system for a little while between the two, and it allows us to translate it. So line A is Minoans, and we don't know that yet, but line B is the Mycenaeans, and we're able to translate that. And you can kind of see a calendar and a tablet of ownership that goes along with the necklace, right? Like that kind of looks familiar. It's almost like a token in Boule that we talked about from Mesopotamia, right? But it's got alphabetic script and not taken from cuneiform, but truly different. And so I'm not an expert in any of that, but it's really interesting to see their writing kind of emerge as well. Another thing about the Mycenaean culture, before we kind of talk about their conflict and downfall, is this idea of tombs. These are tulos tombs, or beehive tombs, as you can kind of see down here, and it's shaped kind of like a beehive. And they create this entryway and build it into a hill very frequently. Like you can kind of see this ground level. And up here on this hill is really the tomb. And they are very, very richly decorated for kings and multiple generations of wealthy families. You see lots of gold in their tombs. They're basically built into the hills, and they're all over the region of Peloponnesus, which is the peninsula right down here on this map. Right? This is Peloponnesus. And you have Sparta and some of these to the south. And again, those are precursor civilizations. And so they have, grandeur. They're more grand than the Mesopotamia, and obviously not as much as the mighty monuments of Egypt and stuff, but still give them a lot of credit. And, they're very smart. They do have a lot of wealth. They're just regional powers. They're not these great empires, but they're certainly sophisticated. And they certainly have as much skill as the bigger empires. They're just different political structures and different wealth overall. So I wanted to kind of show you that they are certainly sophisticated in what they were doing. Now, this brings us to the conflict that they basically end up, when they take over the Minoans, you end up with this increasing conflict among the Mycenaeans and other groups in the Aegean. The conflict seems to be driven by a decline in basically the overall resources. And so wars are going to increase because those resources are precious and everybody needs them. And so if you're ruling a place and you have, and another place has resources and I'm kind of losing my prestige and I'm in decline, well, I'm going to have to go steal from you. I'm going to have to conquer you. And Mycenaeans are ones that really start to struggle and see a lot of their prestige kind of go away. They start working to try and, get that back, right? And so they're going to go win wars and all of that, and so it's really, really vital to them for their survival to try and become these warriors. One of them was like the Trojan War, and Homer writes about it, and he writes it in terms of like a mythology story almost, but there's usually some grain of truth to this. So we know that Mycenaeans probably went and attacked these cities, and so that's around like 800 BC, or somewhere between 1200 and 800 BC. And basically, just bottom line is that you need to remember for quiz and test purposes is that the Mycenaeans and other Greeks really fight with each other in order to get resources. And so they do this until basically the late Bronze Age collapse, and then the Mycenaeans, again, like most of the other big trade empires on the Cause shipwreck, kind of fade out of existence for the most part. They're definitely a victim of the late Bronze Age collapse. And that's going to bring this to a wrap, and then we'll talk more about the archaic Greeks in the next section. Thank you.